ULB Podcast.
Les podcasts de l'Université libre de Bruxelles.
Talking with you, the student's point of view,
here to share ideas,
spark conversations,
and inspire change. Let's get started!
Welcome to our new episode of Talking with the U. This show wants to provide the students an open and safe space to discuss the topic that we deal with as students, but also in a broader sense, the one that concerns us the most as passionate young individuals. Hello, my name is Sara.
And my name is Sara, and we will be hosting this episode today. Welcome to this new month's episode of the Talking with You podcast. As always, we're here to dive into the pressing topics shaping Europe today. This month, Eyes on Europe magazine focuses on the European project in times of change, exploring how the EU is adapting to the shifting political, social, and economic landscape. To bring this topic to life, we're thrilled to have one incredible writer who contributed to this edition of the magazine. I'm very happy to introduce Alessia Ruta, a first-year master's student in European Studies and writer at Eyes on Europe. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi everyone, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Welcome to the podcast. We're very excited to hear your insights and perspective on this fascinating topic. But Sarah, didn't you also write an article for the magazine?
Well, yes, I did. And now I'll step down from the host chair to sit into the guest chair.
There you go. So I guess that makes two of you contributing to the discussion today. So let's give a little bit of context. This topic was chosen for both the magazine and today's episode because we're living in a time of immense change and uncertainty for Europe. From geopolitical shifts to economic challenges and social movements, the EU is at a crossroad. These transformations not only test the resilience of the European project, but also call for fresh ideas and perspective on its future. So may I ask you, Alessia, what did you decide to write about and why do you think it's relevant in line with this month's topic?
My article deals with the concept of gender mainstreaming in peace, security, and foreign policies. And my aim with it is to encourage to include this perspective when discussing how the EU should act in this time of international insecurity. Why it matters? It matters because we mustn't fall into the trap of neutrality. And when I say neutrality, I mean gender blindness. Neutrality equals equality. Because sometimes it happens that when policies are shaped, we believe that having a one-size-fits-all, so something that is aimed at tackling the problems of the entire population without looking at specific needs of specific target groups. I say this because decision makers, policy makers are often tempted to use a one-size-fits-all approach when making decisions. However, if we overlook the specific needs of specific target groups, the policies that we create will never be effective. And when we talk about something so delicate as peace and security, and therefore also foreign policies, as I was saying, it's even more fundamental, even more crucial to have this in mind, because it's with the life of people and human rights of people that we're dealing with. And as we discuss how the European Union should address ongoing conflicts and whether it should have a common army, a common defense policies that's actually supranational and not simply intergovernmental as it is nowadays, it's extremely important to have in mind that women, children, and LGBTQIA plus people have it in a way harder when they're facing troubles such as armed conflicts. This is why my article briefly explains two different approaches. One is the approach of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda that was launched by the United Nations now 25 years ago. Unfortunately, still with too little success. So now just a few sneak peeks from my article that I invite everybody to read. The Women, Peace and Security Agenda was launched in the year 2000 by the United Nations. Now in October it will turn 25 years, and unfortunately what was accomplished so far is not that satisfying, because in the words of the Secretary General of the United Nations, it's still an afterthought. The gender perspective when discussing peace agreements or foreign policies is still something that comes later and is not fully mainstreamed and integrated into the decisions that are taken on this matter. And that's why in the article I present another concept, which is the principles of feminist foreign policy that are different for one reason. They start from the same basis of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda approach, but it's not an appendix to foreign policies and peace policies. The principles are integrated within the main foreign policies of countries and hopefully of the European Union as soon as possible.
So thank you very much, Alessia. Indeed, we invite all our listeners to check out your article, which seems super, super interesting. So thank you for that. And now maybe, Sara, do you want to share something about your article?
Well, my essay, Alessia, very interesting article, and I cannot wait to check it out as soon as the magazine comes out. My article is about the reliance of the EU upon NATO for defense and security. I won't spoil my article, of course, but I will wait for you to read it. Well, Europe overly relies upon external forces for security and defense, and it needs to develop her own defense mechanisms, especially because NATO and the EU don't have the same countries. And if we talk about NATO, of course, we talk about the United States, which is, of course, external to Europe. And for this reason, I believe that Europe should do more to improve upon security and defense, especially as we have a war in our neighborhood, of course. And for this reason, I believe that we should be the ones dealing with, let's say, issue, as, of course, for the United States is a different perspective, and we are the neighborhood in question. I feel like lately wars are a big issue, especially because as we have one in our neighborhood, we should have done something before. Kaja Kallas has said that in the EU countries, we should all contribute 1% more in our GDP to our security and defense budget, as, for example, Russia has 9% of her budget for war making. So I believe that we are not as involved. Maybe the European states don't see this as a bigger threat, but we should be more independent and have a better external policies, especially because we overly relied upon the United States. So for this reason, we should have a better system, but it's also difficult because it's difficult to reach a consensus since Europe has different points of view. We have Western Europe and Eastern Europe that have different perspective on the war and different needs. So Eastern Europe feels, of course, more threatened, while Western Europe does not see it as a big of an issue. So I won't spoil everything, and you will check it out.
Of course, we will check it out. I'm very curious about it. So thank you for sharing that. And now I would maybe pass to the next question, which would be, given the challenges that you've mentioned, so the two of you, what do you think are, as for now, the most urgent priorities for the EU to address in order to maintain unity and adapt to all these changes that we're speaking of?
Well, I think we have many different challenges to face upon our future. I don't want to repeat myself again, but as we already discussed it in our October podcast about the Trump administration and the future challenges we might face the next years. In my opinion, Donald Trump too is going to be a little bit worse than the first. As we can see since the beginning of his presidency, some alliances have changed and shifted, and we can see that compared to when he was president for the first time, we had a different Europe and we had different political landscape. Of course, we have Meloni, that was the only European leader that was invited to the ceremony for the beginning of his presidency. And so we might see a shift in alliances, and maybe Italy's role will be more prominent as we have a Europe that is shifting more and more to the right, as we have also seen in the recent election of the European Parliament. Then Trump has said that he will impose more sanction upon Russia to end the war. And my question is, how will Russia react to that? It was foreseen that maybe Trump will not care about the war in Russia. Then also we have the issue of enlargement. For example, Georgia and the other countries that might join Europe. How would that be perceived by Russia, and how will Europe react to that? The fact that Ukraine is joining the European Union is going to be a big change for the European system in general, as Ukrainian are will be a big majority, and their presence in the European Parliament will shift a lot in the future years. Then maybe digitalization, improvement on internet capabilities. I'm not really into the topic, so I will not dwell delve into that. And as we have seen recently with TikTok and the social media use and privacy, how Meta change and regulations will that impact us? And of course, social media are really important nowadays as it's one of the biggest way to connect people. So yeah, maybe there are other things. And what do you think, Alessia?
Well, I think you said everything there was to say. These are absolutely the top priorities that the EU should face in the upcoming, not even years, I'd say months. And I would just add up to that by saying that there is a fil rouge that unites all of the things that you said, which is that the European Union needs to strengthen itself. So the recipe that many populist leaders and far-right leaders of more national sovereignty, more nationalism are proposing is not going to work out. Because we live in an interdependent world, in a globalized world. So there is not one single issue of these big issues that you mentioned and all of the scenarios that are causing instability in the world that can be solved by one alone or by a small group of countries. That's why cooperation and more supranational activity of the European Union should be encouraged at this point. And going back to what you were saying about Donald Trump and its relationship with NATO, the relationship that the USA will have with NATO and the European Union from now on. I also believe you said something particularly important about the fact that the European Union should have acted sooner. Maybe not even the European Union, but the member states who should have decided before to enhance the competencies of the European Union in the field of peace and security and defense. Because you never know what happens. We can barely know what happens within our shared home of the European Union, and we have even less control over what happens on the other side of the Atlantic. As for today, Donald Trump hasn't taken yet any step in regards to the participation of the USA to the NATO. But we have seen in the first days of his presidency that he kept all of the promises that he made to his electorate. So now I'm wondering, what if he actually lowers the budget that the USA put into NATO? What if he withdraws from NATO? What if Russia escalates and goes even further in Europe and comes across the borders of the European Union, and as he had said, he doesn't let the USA intervene within the NATO treaty, which is actually an obligation he couldn't even decide not to, but he's an unpredictable man, an unpredictable politician. But this really shows, if when we analyze this kind of scenarios, this kind of possibilities, this really shows that the European Union and the member states have not been ambitious enough over the past decades. Because now we cannot play the game of the fortune tellers to try and imagine what could happen. What if the USA do that? What if the Russian Federation does that? What if any other country in the world does another thing? We should arrive prepared. The European Union should come prepared when these situations happen. Instead, what constantly happens is that first we have a problem and then we think of the solution without having any preventive measure. That it's a lack of responsiveness, I would say, of ability to act fast and act in an efficient way.
I completely agree with you, and I also agree with the role that European Union should have. We should not be responding to the issues, but we should be already prepared. In my opinion, the European Union should be that body that already knows the answers and leads the other countries through difficult times. However, this is not the reality, and it's very saddening, as maybe that's what Europe could do in the future, but I don't see it as doable, as we live in very unprecedented times. The only thing that I can say in this moment is to have more unity. Seems very obvious as a thing to say, but that's the only way to move forward, in my opinion. But that's even not doable, as every country has their own agenda, and it's difficult as each country has their own problem to deal with. So yeah, it's very sad to conclude on these notes, but we're just hoping for the best.
maybe I can try to conclude on a more hopeful note by referencing something that is very important to me and that I would also like to be more important to the European Union, but not just as in words, but as in actions, which is human rights. Some of the answers that we need to tackle many of the issues that we have nowadays can already be found in human rights principles. So it's very important not to consider them just words written on paper or vague goals that we put in international treaties. There should be an actual aspiration and there should be an actual compass leading us throughout the problems that we have. And when they were first included in international law, human rights, they were not new as a concept, of course, but they were novelty to international law when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was signed. Decision makers nowadays, especially at the European Union level, in my opinion, must do the same things that decision makers did right after World War II, which is being more ambitious and setting the bar more high in the values and the goals that we want to achieve. This includes human rights. This includes having a gender perspective in all fields of policies, including peace and security and foreign policies. Having in mind and knowing at heart the issues of most vulnerable groups, and that comes also through the representation of the most vulnerable groups at the negotiation tables, at the tables where decisions are being made. The only difference that there should be between that scenario that I was referencing, so post-World War II, and nowadays, is that this step forward mustn't be taken after another devastating conflict. Because, again, I said before, the European Union now acts more trying to find the responses to problems instead of foreseeing what could happen. But in general, the international community is doing the same. So has always done the same in history, like always finding solutions to problems instead of preventing problems. The international system has always evolved after major armed conflicts that killed and injured many and destroyed countries. Maybe if we learn something from history, it is that we should be ambitious before something as devastating as a world war happens.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I really feel that like this episode touched upon so many different topics and so many different priorities, and also I would say suggestions on how we could do better and how, of course, like our leaders, our policymakers could do better. There's always space for improvement, I feel. So thank you very much, Alessia, and also Sara, of course, for sharing her perspective on this. So if you want to read our newest magazine and these articles that we spoke about during this episode, stay tuned on our channels. The magazine is going to come out on the 13th of February 2025, so stay tuned.
That brings us to the end of this episode of Talking with the U, where the student's point of view truly matters. A big thank you to all of you for tuning in, and don't forget to follow us for more discussion on the topic of shaping Europe today. Thank you for listening, and until next time!
This podcast was sponsored by the Institut d'études européennes of the Université Libre de Bruxelles, which we thank for the opportunity of this space.